Well, once again, good evening to everyone and a very warm welcome. Today, we are going to discuss a very interesting and special topic, Greek Paideia. I ask that you open your imagination because this is something so different from what we know as education that it simply overflows and practically disregards everything that is done within society. Therefore, it is another world. And sometimes we hesitate to imagine that, at some point, 2,000 years ago, we actually had this. How is that possible? That we have so thoroughly emptied our concept of education at a time when technology has grown so explosively. Why did we lose this notion, which was so complex, so complete, and so effective? These are some of the curious things that happen in history. Why is it that sometimes we choose one sector, one factor to develop, while others are left behind? And others end up being lost, sometimes over time. Today, there are already several people dedicated to studying this Greek model of education. But it is still difficult to find ways to build a bridge between what was and what is. Today, we will try to understand and convey this spirit to you. Of course, I have based myself on the great book by the writer Werner Jaeger, which is Paideia. It is a huge book, but he made a summary based on the fundamental points, just so that we can grasp the spirit. The spirit of what Paideia is and how in some way it could be considered in our own historical time. So let us begin. Paideia, paths toward a holistic education. This is something we need to understand, what it truly means. Holistic education. In other words, it is almost like becoming literate all over again. It is a word that we use today in a sense very different from its original meaning. Speaking very briefly about the pre-Hellenic periods of Greece. That is everything that happened before Hellenism. Werner Jaeger works with this historical line of Greece, stating that the spirit of Paideia, even though it was not called by that name, is so ancient that it is pre-Homeric. In other words, it belongs to that period from the 20th to the 12th centuries BC. There was already an understanding within that civilization, a kind of founding myth, that this civilization possessed a certain sense of honor. There was a certain status of heroism, that is a kind of national pride that gave a unique character to the inhabitants of that region. Now, this was greatly reinforced with the arrival of Homer. In the Homeric period, Homer, by creating his Iliad and his Odyssey, provides a model of what it means to be Greek. Thus, the Greek citizen had aspirations embodied by Achilles, Hector, Odysseus. These were lofty aspirations of civilization and heroism, a capacity for self-sacrifice, for ideals greater than merely surviving. And this was passed down from generation to generation in a very significant way. So much so that it was very common for young people to know by heart many verses and songs from the Odyssey or the Iliad. Memorization is a resource deeply present in ancient civilizations. Just look, for example, at India, where the Brahmins memorized, and still memorize to this day, the Vedas. Because in India, there was a class, the caste, known as the Brahmins. Here, it was all the young people, of course not from the entire society, but the young aristocrats, the sons of citizens, who were all taught from the cradle with the Iliad and the Odyssey as the foundational ideas of civilization. Thus, Homer was tremendously important during this period. Later, we will see in the classical period there was also the remarkable importance of the advent of philosophy, brilliant as it was. Above all, there is a central axis, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but there were many other influential figures as well. In this book, Werner Jaeger spends a great deal of time describing everyone who influenced Greek Paideia. He conducts a truly exhaustive study, a thorough reference. He addresses all the influences that Greece received. But fundamentally, from the perspective of philosophy, it was these three, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. They also provided a very special notion of what it meant to be Greek. This gradually became almost a manual of identity, a guiding reference, a higher objective for the entire civilization. Everyone who arrived aspired to become this ideal. In other words, it was a purpose, a horizon of possibilities received and shaped from birth. So consider this carefully. For humanity, the gods and heroes served as models of conduct. Although literacy rates were low at the time, meaning few people could read, this knowledge was passed on by rhapsodes who memorized, recited, and taught it to the youth. They were memorized and sung everywhere, in lyric poetry, didactic songs, communal chants, during celebrations, and in youth education. Young people were encouraged to memorize many passages. This tradition was passed down through generations. As I mentioned, this is very common in other civilizations as well. And here as well, knowledge was passed down through repetition and listening, even though most people at that time could not read. Only a very small group of people were able to read. Yet even so, the Iliad and the Odyssey were transmitted from generation to generation. Memorization greatly aids in assimilation. This is quite obvious. What we know by heart becomes a resource at hand when we put it into practice in life. How should I act according to Homer? I don't remember. If you have verses and verses memorized, this becomes almost a self-discipline through repetition. I am constantly reminded of what Hector said, what Achilles said, what Odysseus said, in short, of what all these great characters have spoken. And the importance of this lies in establishing a comparison between what I say and what these heroes say, serving as a reference for self-improvement, a reference for growth throughout life. This is important, and it is one of the things we will discuss in this lecture. Paideia was not just for the young. Paideia was a process of education for one's entire life. While you were alive, you were being educated, refined toward that life goal set forth by the Greeks. So it was very comprehensive. I often use an image that seems fitting to me. As soon as a young person entered Athenian society, they were embraced by Paideia. In every way you can imagine, through all possible cultural avenues, through traditions, through all the elements of civilization, he was embraced by Paideia, in such a way that he, in turn, simply embraced it back and followed a kind of contradance with this historical role that was assigned to him, and always with the understanding that he was there to perfect himself in pursuit of these ideals. In other words, there was no notion of statism, I am ready, which is quite a curious invention of our times nowadays. I was surprised to encounter this a few times as a teacher when I spoke about some classics to my students. And every ancient classic speaks of humanity in search of self-improvement. And sometimes I was surprised to hear from students, self-improvement, why I am happy the way I am. This is a very contemporary phenomenon. Being content with the way we are is something unprecedented, historically speaking. There has always been a goal of self-improvement, of growth, in other words, of drawing closer to an ideal. And at that moment, Homer fulfilled this fundamental role. Hesiod as well, who comes 2 centuries later with his works and days and his theogony, helps to bring this reference point into daily life, to the common person. In other words, Hesiod also played a very significant role there. Plato and the myth, the founder. Plato, in a dialogue we will mention here, which is the Republic, speaks about the importance for a civilization to have a founding myth. A myth that creates a sense of honor, of dignity, of the need to live up to those who founded it. So, for example, he recounts in Thebes the myth of the Spartoi, where dragons' teeth were sewn into the ground and from them warriors sprang forth. He says, well, these things are extremely important for the self-esteem of the Theban people, so that they know who they are, so that they may wish to honor that legacy. You know that when, during World War II, Japan was devastated, the emperor stood at the steps of his palace holding a mirror of the sun goddess, Amaterasu, and the sword of a certain god. He displayed these and said, look, we will rebuild everything. We are children of the sun. And the inspiration this provided for that civilization to rise again at an extraordinary pace, the motivation it gave to rebuild was truly exceptional. There was nothing else like it. No technical or practical solution could have given the Japanese spirit what this did. This is what the myth provided. We are children of the sun. The goddess Amaterasu is the sun. We are her descendants. Here is her mirror. We are descendants of her heroic brother, so-and-so. I am here to be worthy of being children of the sun. And they rebuilt everything. It is truly remarkable what a founding myth is capable of accomplishing. Centaur? There is a poem by Fernando Pessoa, which is the first Ulysses. I don't know if you are familiar with Fernando Pessoa's book called Mensagem, which is the most beautiful book of poetry he wrote. In Mensagem, there is a poem called Primero Ulises, where he speaks of the myth that exists in Portugal, that Ulysses once passed through there and did something in that place. Therefore, Ulysses would be the founder of that land and that people. Then he says, he who, without being, became. In other words, because he did not even exist, there was no mythical hero, but he bestowed a mark of honor upon the Portuguese people. We are descendants of Ulysses. Therefore, we are not just anything. The psychological weight of this is enormous. It is immense. And Plato spoke of the necessity of a founding myth. If we do not create one, false myths are created, as we will talk about later. False stories that occupy this space often have the opposite effect. Instead of raising our self-esteem, they lower it. It remains among us very discreetly. Which of us, at least I went through this, in school as children, did not hear in history class that we were founded by criminals, by those whom Portugal did not want and sent here? Even if that were true, because it is highly debatable, it was not only those men who came here. Even if that were true, it is not something good to be told in school. No, that should not even be allowed. If it is real, let it be forgotten, let it be erased, because it has an extraordinarily harmful effect on the self-esteem of a people. We have no idea what we are doing when we do something like this. We do not understand what these realities mean on the psychological level, because it is these, in truth, that define life. It is not the realities on the physical plane, but the realities on the psychological plane that shape our lives. Therefore, Plato speaks of the founding myth. And the founding myth of the Greeks then was situated there. It was found in Homer. Read in the Odyssey, in the gods, in the heroes, in the grandeur that this people found in their ancestors. And how to live up to these ancestors, how to be worthy of them. This is fundamental, poetic model and philosophical model. Philosophical model in the classical period, Plato, Homer. As we have said, fundamental Plato, together with Socrates and Aristotle, were essential. Plato, above all, when he speaks in his dialogue, The Republic, he offers a description in this dialogue of what it means to be a good man, a complete man, and a good citizen. But he does so in such detail, with such precision, going down to specifics, even how this person would eat, where he should build his cities. In other words, in great detail, what was expected of a good citizen in Greece. This philosophical model was also fundamental. So, for the Greeks, what they called kalos kai agathos was essential. The beautiful and the good simultaneously, a civilization that values aesthetics, beauty, and care for the body, but also and above all preserves the beauty of the soul, which is goodness, so that both could unite and form that ideal world they dreamed of. A word that for them held immense value even before the word paideia, arete, virtue. Virtue was the fundamental pursuit and the code of honor for every Greek. I must be virtuous. That is why I am here. And this, as a cultural value, was instilled from the cradle, repeated by parents, by teachers, by society as a whole. Imagine the weight of that. The foundational formative weight that a belief like this carries. Continuing on, another important aspect within Paideia was the idea of the universe as a cosmos. We will even discuss that when the Middle Ages arrived, this idea often persisted. Within the cradle of Christianity, it was interpreted as providence, that is, that things are written. It's not exactly that things are written, but rather that they consider the universe to have order. This is also a very recurring idea. India also thinks this way, and so did Egypt. The universe is not chaotic. It is a cosmos. Things have an order, a reason for being, a purpose. And what about humanity? When humans intervene, they can simply align themselves with nature, walking in harmony with it, which is the best way because they flow together with nature, or they can go against it, which will bring all kinds of obstacles and suffering, for nature will close its doors to them. But humanity does not change the course of nature, and nature is not chaotic. It has a purpose. It seeks to lead all beings toward unity. It aims to bring all beings to the highest harmony they are capable of, to the fullness of their human condition. In truth, the entire universe is being guided. All beings, not just humans, are being led toward their state of fulfillment. And this is the hand of nature. Those who strive to evolve toward their fullness are walking hand in hand with nature. Those who do not are going against the current, subject to all the shocks that this may cause. Thus, the idea of an ordered universe is to banish arbitrariness from life. In other words, adversities have meaning and ultimately lead to redemption. You will see this in the myths. Oedipus makes an involuntary mistake there. In the end, he is restored by the gods and even becomes the patron of the great city of Athens. In other words, he goes through all adversities and overcomes them with dignity. And in the end, he is elevated to the status of a hero, a myth, an example. Thus, adversities are seen as necessary for human growth. This is a very different spirit. It is a spirit that recognizes adversity as an inherent part of life, as necessary trials for you to reach your goals. Carl Gustav Jung used to say that when we approach a portal, the lion guarding that portal would appear. In other words, every time you approach a portal, seeking to move to a higher level of consciousness, there is a guardian you will have to face. And you must pay the price of these trials. And knowing that difficulties are tests is truly inspiring, my friends. because we understand that they are not meant to bring us down. They are meant to elevate us. The worst thing that can happen in the face of injustice is for you to believe that it truly is an injustice. When facing adversity, it is to think that it is chaotic, to believe that it has fallen upon you by chance, that it has no meaning, and that you are a victim, because then you end up endlessly talking about your wounds, and you remain stuck there, unable to grow. So in spirit, I sometimes joke with my students because I see this a lot in children and teenagers who are addicted to video games. If you want to make an enemy out of a teenager, give them an easy game. They enjoy difficulties, don't they? They like challenges. They know that they will be elevated to a new level of awareness, and they enjoy that. In other words, adversities are like a heroic challenge, and that is how they are regarded. One should not be discouraged in the face of difficulties. On the contrary, they honored you by showing that you are worthy of facing them. This means you are on a hero's journey. You are being considered worthy of ascending such a significant step. Otherwise, it would not be placed before you. The steps appear in proportion to what our legs are capable of climbing. Therefore, if there is a large step before me, it means I am able to climb much higher than I imagine. So, this compels me to bring forth my latent powers. Thus, adversity was viewed in this way. The heroes, the gods, all of them faced adversities along their paths, and that is why they are as great as they are. This is part of what is called the heroic spirit. To elevate a person from inner chaos through integration with universal order. This is fundamental, being integrated with the universal order. He would emerge from his inner chaos and allow the man, with a capital M, to triumph within the man. Hence, I brought up the classic example of the centaur and the minotaur. Both are a mixture of man and animal, but in the case of the centaur, the human dominates over the animal. In the minotaur, the animal dominates over the human. So, the idea was to be the centaur, not to kill the animal self within us because it is necessary and part of our survival, but to ensure that the human aspect prevails, that you hold the reins of your own life. All human criteria should be dominant. In other words, instincts, reflexes, violence, everything that is animalistic, everything that is bestial, should not hold the reins of your life. The reins of your life should be in human values, in human virtues, innate. And this ensures the condition of humanity. Therefore, it is one of the elements that are part of Greek culture. More and more, the hero is the one who is thoughtful, prudent, who possesses self-control, who knows how to act at the right moment, at the right time. Do you remember Odysseus? When he returns to Ithaca, and the suitors are inside his house, in great numbers, creating chaos. He knows how to restrain himself. He knows how to restrain himself. He acts only at the precise moment, at the right time, when he has all the tools in his favor. This self-control, this strategy, which is illustrated, for example, in Odysseus, is a symbol of the person who has mastered the animal within. He has mastered his impulses. Therefore, his actions are precise, intelligent, objective, and always focused on the goal of becoming a more complete human being, a citizen, and a more complete person. As I mentioned to you, Paideia, which comes from the word for child, is a term that from a certain point onward began to be used in Greece. At first, the word arete was used, which is a much older term. The idea was that all civilizing sources, all culture, should lead to arete, and later this came to be called Paideia. Paideia was intended for all people within society. Therefore, it carries an elevated sense of formation, which includes at the same time civilization, culture, tradition, literature, and education. In other words, everything. Basically, Plato says that the Greek man should be educated through gymnastics and music. Music is the art of the muses. It is not just music as we understand it today. It was almost everything because the totality of the arts belonged to the muses. Many of the disciplines in which they were educated belonged to the muses. Therefore, it was an education that aimed to sculpt the human being so that he would become ever more worthy of the condition of being Greek, worthy of the human condition, noble, heir of the gods, heir of the heroes. And this is truly an embrace that shapes and causes him to open up his edges, whether they are his impulses or his bad inclinations, as things he must correct immediately, because otherwise he distances himself from this archetype, toward which all civilization moves. In other words, if he does not approach the ideal of a man, he brings dishonor to his father and to his city. He is a dishonor to his parents and to his teachers, to those who guide him. And no one wants that. In other words, it is an ideal that truly frames the human being and embraces him from all sides, because education in terms of formation is like this. Education in terms of the human beings you interact with in society everywhere is like this. Everything leads you in this direction. As I have already told you, Plato recommended gymnastics and music. Gymnastics to educate the body, and music to educate the soul. Music, including a variety of arts, a range of learning. The arts of the muses, which are many. You know, there is even a muse of astronomy, for example. There is a muse of oratory, a muse for everything. In other words, the arts of the muses as a whole. He always emphasized that music should come before gymnastics, because a well-formed soul recognizes the need to shape the body. However, a well-formed body does not necessarily recognize the need to shape the soul. Therefore, much of this educational model was also reinforced by Plato, already in the classical era. His models of education and the formation of the ideal Greek man, of an ideal city, of how to come as close as possible to it, of his heritage that we have received from the past. We are sons, grandsons, descendants of heroes and gods. Therefore, we must honor this lineage. The Muses and Mnemosyne. This is an interesting point, because the Muses are daughters of the goddess Mnemosyne, who is the goddess of memory, with the god who represents power. In other words, there were two attributes that a person needed to have: power over oneself, to constantly self-transform, to perfect oneself throughout life. All the time and at the same time, memory. It was essential not to forget the most important things in life. For example, the virtues, the errate. The great virtues that define me as a human being must always be kept in mind. So I am someone for whom the idea of the good that Plato speaks of so much in the Republic, is what guides my actions. And is it a good that is increasingly universal and not just for myself? I am a weak person. I am someone who, without respecting the elders, without respecting order within society, without instilling order, in my actions, these things had to be permanently present in my memory, as a means to encourage you to educate yourself. So, memorization was a very powerful technique used in that time. And today, notice well that we no longer have much of this. Memorization is used in school just to take tomorrow's test. The day after tomorrow, we have forgotten everything. Memorization was a tool for self-shaping, for self-formation. It was widely used. And one of the things they asked of the gods was not to forget. Not to forget who they were. Not to forget what was expected of them within the order of nature. So this was one of the fundamental requests of the Greek person, of the Greek youth, that they would not lose the memory of who they were. Continuing here, everything should be pedagogy, everything within society. If I dance, it is pedagogy. If I train in horsemanship, it is pedagogy, because through horsemanship I learn virtues, and through dance I learn virtues. They are not an end in themselves. They are a means. All the arts, all the crafts are means. The end is virtue. So I am being formed, whatever I do, at every moment. So, literature, dance, music, good music. These were the first things taught to children. They were fundamental. The influence of music on character formation was considered very important. Theater, sculpture, mathematics, architecture, astronomy, horsemanship. In other words, everything you did within society was aligned with this ideal of the virtuous human being. A viridi, of the Greek person, descendant of the gods and heroes. One did these things to draw closer to that ideal, not in vain. Today, we sometimes see well-intentioned initiatives to include extracurricular subjects in children's curricula, such as dance, music, or gymnastics. Sometimes, children are sent to school during alternate shifts to participate in these activities. We try to repeat these practices at times, modeling ourselves after these examples, but simply believing that this is enough. Without a guiding thread, because nowadays no one is truly concerned with virtue, this is not a goal for anyone. By simply piling up disciplines, we believe we will achieve the same effect as the Greeks. This is madness. It is as if I saw a necklace that one of you is wearing, with little red, brown, and green stones. Then I take it, I will do something like your necklace. I start gathering the little red, brown, and green stones, and it doesn't use a thread. I just place the stones side by side. Of course, this has no consistency whatsoever. When the supporting base shakes, these stones will scatter everywhere. There is no thread. It is no use even to place philosophy within education. It is pointless if there is no guiding thread running through everything. And what is the guiding thread? I want to be a virtuous man. I want to be a virtuous citizen, worthy of my condition as a Greek and as a human being. As Socrates used to say, led a beautiful life, that is, one based on truth and goodness. All things lead to a beautiful life, based on truth and goodness. All these elements of civilization. So, when I told you it was an embrace, I wasn't joking. It truly was an embrace, because wherever you went, whatever craft you dedicated yourself to, whatever art, through that, you were also being educated to be a good citizen and a good human being. Through anything at all. Of course, keeping things in perspective, when we carry out our program, for example, Children for Good, we do something based on this principle, which is the fact that the child takes extra Portuguese classes, but also studies philosophy at the same time. He studies, capoeira, martial arts, but also studies alongside that philosophy through the learning of values of how they treat one another, of the way they coexist together. There is philosophy in everything. So this was a spirit, a bond that united all the disciplines of the Greek world. There were many. The education of young Greeks often included various things, aimed at both the body and the soul, all of them connected by this thread, to be a virtuous human being. The greater the acquisition of the teachings of Paideia, the freer a person will be. From ignorance to a rational and conscious way of life. See how interesting this is. The idea, little by little, drawing a parallel with what we have today. Between us, as impartially as possible, can we say that a person in our times who has 20 years of schooling is necessarily more honest than someone who has 10? Are they more just? Are they more fraternal? We cannot say absolutely anything about the human quality of this person who has gone through a long period of education. Or I am exaggerating. We cannot say anything about them as a human being. Therefore, we see that there is a huge difference here. Because what they say is that when you have a well-formed human being, you have an exemplary human being at some level. He is striving to perfect himself more and more. But on some level, he is a person you can trust. I say, so-and-so is well-formed. You can rest assured. There you have a human being you can trust, someone you can rely on because there is solidity. What we call education nowadays has absolutely nothing to do with solidity. It has nothing to do with virtue, nor with character, nor with anything of the sort. So, what is it that we are really giving to people? A technical training to do things, and not a human formation to make oneself, to build oneself. And it is always good to remember that we came here to make ourselves. Everything else is secondary. Everything else nature does on its own. It does not need us for that. It needs us to build ourselves. That is the fundamental objective. And we have an education that does not help us to build ourselves. Therefore, it is different from Paideia and its foundation. It has simply become technical information. There were many elements within Paideia, including techni, which was to train for a specific practical craft that the person would perform. But at a certain point, everything else fell away and only the technique remained. There is nothing else left there. This is quite curious, this emptying out of what we consider to be education. The concept of errate, virtue. To act in accordance with reason is to be virtuous. Reason guided by universal principles. It's as if you considered, you know those children's games with lots of little letters for them to form words? They arrange the little letters and form words according to a principle they have. The tree is right here in front of me. I remember the word tree. I arrange the little letters according to that word. I arrange the little letters according to the word chair, according to the word light, and so on. I keep arranging them. This would be more or less the same with our thoughts. I look towards justice, and I organize my thoughts in a way that is coherent with it, that leads me there. I look towards kindness, and I organize my thoughts in a way that leads me there. Let it be a reason guided by universal principles. Let it be values. This would be true virtuous conduct. To act in accordance with reason. Reason guided by universal principles. In Latin, this was called humanitas. This type of study. In our case, it would be a humanistic education, which aims first and foremost at the formation of the human being, beginning with oneself. As a good citizen, as a good human being. Arete is the fundamental word before the use of the word paideia. Therefore, the word paideia is more recent. Arete dates back to the pre-Homeric period. It was already an objective for that civilization. It was already a pursuit. Plato has a phrase that I find perfect, everyone. I find it quite interesting. He says the following: the essence of all true education, paideia, is that it gives a person the desire and longing to become a perfect citizen. And it teaches him to command and obey, having justice as its foundation. Allow me to repeat a small excerpt here, because this is extremely important to memorize. What does education provide? It gives a person the desire and longing to become a perfect citizen. That is what education provides. Since when has our education awakened in us the desire and longing to be a perfect human being, a perfect citizen? Where is that? This longing, this constant desire for self-improvement, that is what education awakens. That is what it brings to the surface. The very word education speaks of this. It means to educe. To educe is to bring forth. To bring forth this desire, this yearning to become a perfect citizen, a perfect human being. A yearning that never ceases. As long as there is life, there exists the possibility for me to build within myself a better human being, a better citizen. This should be behind all our pursuits, and it is this that education ought to cultivate, to awaken this within the human being. In other words, the thirst, the yearning, the desire to become a perfect citizen. Notice how extraordinary this is. How extraordinary, once you have awakened this. Where will this human being go from there, toward this, for the rest of their life? You have ensured for them a path that is pedagogical at every moment, and you will continue to grow at all times. You will always be seeking self-improvement behind everything that you do. Not only mastery of learned subjects, but also moral excellence. In other words, it was not simply about studying the subjects taught, for example, in techne, but about moral excellence, uniting mental and physical abilities within a well-formed character so that a person could become the best human being and citizen possible. Just to recall what Plato points out, because he does not use this exact expression. Character formation is evident, but he speaks of human inclinations. That from our earliest childhood, we have inclinations. To enjoy certain things and to reject others. We should be educated in such a way that we are inclined toward the things that humanize us, that is, toward errate virtue, and reject all that which makes us more animalistic. So, do you know what this means? If we are educated in this way, this is character formation. I move toward what I ought to because I ought to, and because I enjoy it. Because my taste has been shaped for this purpose. So I have a dual motivation to pursue my full human condition, because I ought to and because I enjoy it. And this is what is called character formation, according to Plato. learning to appreciate, refining one's taste, which is something that, good news, we can reshape throughout our lives. We can reshape our tastes, periodically taking a detailed look at what we like and examining them, putting our preferences to the test to see if there are things we ought to change. And we should do the same with our aversions as well, in such a way that I train myself to appreciate all that is human and to reject all that is animalistic, all that is brutal. And this is what constitutes good character formation. Therefore, we should be careful when we say, so and so has bad character, because it is truly difficult to find someone of genuinely good character. Not even ourselves. Could we guarantee that everything we like is truly humanizing? Or do we enjoy many trivial things that simply hold us back on our path, or even make us regress? We have not subjected ourselves to this kind of scrutiny. Therefore, we must exercise a certain caution when we go about labeling people. Continuing. In summary, the idea was the pursuit of a human being, an archetype, an ideal human, a complete person with well-established virtues, grounded in cultural foundations from birth. This is the guiding principle for the entire educational process. That is, from the very cradle. He possesses a cultural foundation, and this serves as the guiding principle for the entire educational process. The pursuit of an archetype of a human being complete with well-established virtues. Well, today it is evident that our current models do not quite follow this path. It has become a material achievement. The pursuit of desires, the pursuit of possessions, the pursuit of pleasures. This is what is considered fulfillment. At no point are we told, you came into this world to be virtuous. Nor are we even told what it means to be virtuous. Nor are we shown the example of someone who was. To inspire our imagination, this is fundamental. Epictetus, the great Stoic philosopher, says that the seeds of human greatness require a model. In order to blossom and germinate, we should have a model in history. Our heroes should be cultivated. We should have a model. We are descendants of such people who accomplished such things. We should have our own myth in which we see ourselves reflected. In other words, we came into this world to be as virtuous as those who came before us. Why? We are heirs to this tradition, to this spirit. We should have our own myth. We should honor this lineage that we consider as inherent to the human being. And this created within each people, in each civilization, in such a way that they complement one another. But each one must have their own sense of honor, their fundamental notion of honor, that embraces them in all their activities. Let everything be coordinated and cohesive because of this. Complementary disciplines were not isolated, nor intended merely to display artistic expressions, but were directed toward this formation. So, everything you did, if you danced like the muses on Mount Helicon, to, through dance, attain greater harmony. The helix, which is Mount Helicon. Through dance, I will reach more harmony and ascend. If I sing to imitate Orpheus with his lyre, who also sought to harmonize the four vehicles of his personality. By playing his lyre, he sought to become a more harmonious being, a more beautiful being, morally speaking. If I play, if I sing, if I dance, everything I do has a meaning that is directed toward arete. Now, if I simply give people no reference point and have them study music, have them study dance, what will come of that? Sometimes, a psalm whose lyrics incite all kinds of crime, as we see in our times. Sometimes, a dance that is merely a sensual game, lacking much responsibility and marked by extreme vulgarity. In other words, the disciplines themselves do not work miracles. They must be connected to a higher purpose. This is the great secret, the great key of Paideia. That is, a clear ideal, civilizational, a distinctly human ideal, very well established. Today, there is a disconnect from the formative aspect and even a certain tendency to pass the responsibility along. Once, I read a book written by a recent educator from Sao Paulo titled, Who Educates Me? And he spoke about this passing of responsibility. The school says, no, formation is not our role. That's for the parents. Here, we only provide information. But how can that be? A child is learning 24 hours a day, everywhere they go. So, who holds the responsibility for educating a young person in our society? Everyone. Wherever they go, they are being educated. Even the popcorn vendor on the corner is an educator. In every place, they are being educated. Who is responsible for being a role model for the youth in our society? Every citizen of this city. They know that what they do has repercussions, it echoes. It is clear that they must make the sacrifice to become better, so that others, by following their example, can also become better. Therefore, everyone educates through life, wherever they may be. This game of passing the responsibility for who educates me in today's society is somewhat curious, even amusing. Imagine that I am a parent, and therefore, according to this standard, I am an educator as long as I am a parent. But in my profession, I am a teacher, a lawyer, or any other role. And in my profession, I am not acting as a parent, so I have no obligation to educate. And there, I am just anyone, behaving in any manner. It is evident that I will be neither an educator nor a miseducator. I will not be able to do anything properly because I am being inconsistent. And this inconsistency is noticed by our children. They are very intuitive. Inconsistency is especially apparent to children and adolescents. It is right on the surface. They realize that what we are teaching lacks consistency. Therefore, if I must be consistent to be an educator, I have to be an educator 24 hours a day, wherever I am. I am always educating, and I am responsible for those who are inspired by my example to follow their own path in life. India teaches that, in fact, a portion of the karma of those who were inspired by us and went astray is also ours. I find this idea quite powerful. Those who were inspired by you and made mistakes, a part of their karma is yours, the reference point you have spread throughout society. Today, our founding myths have been replaced by complexes and alienation. So, as I mentioned to you, we are the result of the outlaws who were expelled from Portugal. We are a people who are not serious. We are a people who are unruly and disorganized. For heaven's sake, there is no way to build a foundation of self-esteem or a reference point like this. There is simply no way. The tendency is for this to persist, this underestimation of our spirit. We lack a common spirit. We underestimate our own characteristics, and this lack of self-confidence holds us back from a human development perspective. The idea of corruption, for example, is something that has become ingrained in our history, and it just doesn't stop. Why is that? We lack a civilizational value, a clear virtue that would allow us to free ourselves from these things. Instead of being exceptions, they have become the rule. We are unable to eradicate certain evils from our history. We lack basic points of reference. We do not have a sense of self-esteem, a model, a founding myth, an image to strive for, a value that serves as our reference point. What do I live for? Asked the Greek man. I live for the virtues, my friend. Of course, what does the modern man live for? To have money and comfort. And after you have money and comfort, what do you do with the rest of your life? You seek to have even more money and more comfort, but you keep going. That's all. That's it. Do you realize how little that is? This makes a person go around in circles. Because when they achieve that, they're still not happy, still not fulfilled. What will they seek then? More of the same, more of that. This never ends and leads nowhere. In other words, there are two words that define this situation well: lost and disoriented. It is the person without a north, without an orient. They go around in circles, wandering aimlessly. This is more or less what we experience. The reintroduction of philosophy in high school was the same thing. It's just another bead on the necklace I mentioned earlier, but there's no thread running through it. So it becomes a collection of information, of concepts that certain people thought about. But what does it have to do with my life? What is this inviting me to become? Nothing, there is nothing. It's not enough to simply add philosophy. It's not enough to add music, to add physical education, to add dance. It's not enough to just add things. All of this must be guided by a single value. Everything needs to be connected. Therefore, this is not the solution. Adding more subjects, making students study more, doing more activities. If this is not connected to a guiding spirit that permeates the whole of society, we will not succeed in producing the civilitas, the civilization we envision, the formation of a human being who moves from the centaur to the centaur. Is it possible to recreate culture? Is it really possible to reinvent culture? Of course it is, because at some point every culture was born. It emerged from something different and became what it is today. Can this process be a conscious, intentional one? I believe it can. I find it remarkable, for example, how we are able to, through mass media, pour content over ourselves. Suddenly, a character from a primetime soap opera, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, whatever, everyone in society starts dressing just like them. A mannerism they have, or a phrase they use, soon everyone is using it too. We are capable of achieving incredible things. Of course, this is a matter of fashion, right? It passes very quickly because it is not perpetually sustained. But we are able to transmit things, and people absorb them with remarkable ease. And what kinds of things are these? Products designed to generate profit for a handful of private, personal interests. But what we have achieved through this explosion of traffic, of information in our historical moment, this media intoxication, as I once heard it called, a term I found interesting, this sheer volume of information we receive is able to generate an influence unlike anything seen in the past. How was information disseminated in the past? It was a much slower process, a much more complex process. We are able to disseminate information. However, we would need a thoughtful mind, someone who truly wishes to spread this information. According to a civilizational ideal, following a model of civilization, truly instilling national pride, pride in our people, providing a reference point that could serve as a catalyst for change. So I put it this way, each people has its most favorable aspect. Take an idea, draw from each people, from each community, from each civilization, an idea, a most favorable aspect, and set it as a goal. Not that I will achieve it, but that I already am. Live as if we have already attained what we aspire to become. I even included here, as a mere example, an idea, Brazil. I believe that Brazil, as it is, with its history and everything, has every reason for us to consider it the most inclusive nation in the world. It is not. We are full of prejudice, I know that. But if we all started to believe in this, soon the wrongdoer would become the exception. And everyone would begin to think in this way. Of course, the wrongdoer, the one who transgresses, feels it. The rule is encouraged. If he felt like the exception or ostracized, it would be much harder for him to persist. Our history includes people from everywhere with many ways of coming together to form our society. Therefore, this is something in our favor, even our very nature. It is inclusive. We have an extraordinary biodiversity, and everyone coexists harmoniously with one another. Could we not have the myth of being the most inclusive people in the world, who warmly welcome all those who come with goodwill, who know how to harmonize all legitimate differences? Could we not have this? We could. It is a matter of believing. This is somewhat what positive psychology suggests, to behave now as the person you aspire to become in the future. You begin to see yourself as that person right now in this very moment. Plato speaks of this in his dialogue, The Republic. He outlines a perfect city. He turns to the people and asks, "Do you understand?" "We do. Did you see how I built it?" "We saw. Do you believe in it?" "We believe." "Then from this moment on, consider yourselves citizens of this city, and then one day it will come to exist. In other words, if we create a myth of this kind and nurture it from all sides and continue to nurture it, soon there will be a sense of national pride around it. We welcome tourists warmly. We are highly receptive people. We have a multifaceted background. We are fraternal. We are inclusive, the most inclusive country in the world. Well, at some point, it becomes real. At some point, it stays. It is simply an idea, just an idea. Of course, there may be much better ideas. Do you realize that every people has its own characteristic that you can elevate to the level of a myth? And it can generate national pride around it. And when it becomes a myth, it enters our minds in a subtle way. It constantly demands coherence from us. It enters in a subliminal way and stays there. I'm among the most inclusive people in the world. I can't be otherwise, or I wouldn't be Brazilian. Being Brazilian means being inclusive. Do you see the psychological influence and feedback loop this creates? This is just an example of how it could be done. But that it could be done, it certainly could. Is it something that can be absorbed overnight? Perhaps not. Perhaps it would take a generation or two working continuously in this direction for you to have this as a fact. Considering how little we change from one generation to the next, if you set a goal like this, it would generate an enormous transformation from one generation to another. On the other hand, a country that has national pride, that has a value, has something to honor. That is what it means to be Brazilian. One could even create a myth of a Brazilian who embodied these qualities to give it more concreteness. History could be used, choosing a historical figure and making them a reference for this ideal. Thus, the myth is created. Just as we have created all the ideologies and dogmas of society, we would know how to create myths and sustain them. If there were those who had this interest and knew how to do it, we restructure a society that is entirely interwoven with a thread of values. This is possible. We must work towards the cultural development of the image of the fully realized citizen of the 21st century. What is the citizen of the 21st century? We only know what they have, the technology they hold in their hands, what they can do in terms of modernity. But we do not know who they are, how they think, what their characteristics are, their values, what they want from life, or where they wish to go. Who is the citizen of the 21st century? I want to know them as a human being. That old story I always mention in my lectures, the pediment of a temple supported by two columns. One column represents the things we develop. The other is the development of ourselves. If you do not develop, or if you develop only one column, the pediment slides off, and civilization is destroyed. So, when we think about the human being of the 21st century, the values they should possess, what kind of human being should exist, even to handle all this technology they have created without risk, this is essential. Where should they aspire to go? What is their reference point in terms of humanity, and also in terms of each people, because that is important. It is necessary. Where would we want to arrive? The myth of the 21st century citizen is a necessity. It must emerge at some point. Because this is what makes culture begin to be persuasive. It starts to shape itself to your being and to be with you wherever you go. A process of formation begins. Culture is already formative, whatever form it may take. Sometimes it is more deformative than formative. It would begin to work in a direction consciously chosen, with a purpose, to ensure that the human being is a formed being, moving ever more toward becoming a citizen and a fully realized human. We work with borrowed myths. We should work with the collective assimilation of a new model as our goal. Indeed, we work with borrowed myths. Justice, take Themis from Rome. Isn't that so? Where is our own symbol of justice? There isn't one. We have to take it from Rome. Love, take Venus from the Latin tradition. In other words, we do not have our own symbols. We have to work with borrowed symbols. A civilization that has created spacecraft capable of diverting a comet from its collision course in space is not capable of constructing its own myths. Whether based on historical figures or not, it is unable to create its own myths. In other words, what a strange technology. Everything is directed outward, and nothing is directed inward, nothing within. Things that were once fundamental from a classical perspective, we no longer know how to do. Everything had its own myth. To inhabit a house, there was an entire creation of a myth so that you could enter that house and it would come to embody the sense of home. Everything had a ceremony, a founding myth. For those who are familiar with the ancient city, with the literature, they know this. Everything possessed this culture. Everything had a founding myth. Everything had a ceremony. This awakened in the human being a sense of honor. I must honor this pact, this myth, this primordial moment. I must return to it. The direction of cultural products was aimed at this purpose. All of them serve this end. So, our soap opera heroes. They are human beings who, in general, seek what in life? What is it? What is their purpose in life? To win over so and so, to get rid of someone else? That's it. I can't even say anymore because it's been so many years since I've watched soap operas, but it probably hasn't gone beyond that. To take revenge on someone who did something, is that it? What is the great life goal of the role models we create? It's madness to distribute such models to a civilization. It is an orchestrated trivialization. Society has been trivialized to a ridiculous level. In other words, these are models of complete superficiality. Besides having our own superficial lives, we also spend our time watching the superficiality of others. Imagine if we started to have cultural products that were truly stimulating. I remember once watching an interview with an actor who played a very important character. Has anyone here seen that movie, Gladiator? It's a character of indisputable honor, isn't it? Truly extraordinary. Russell Crowe, who is the actor that played this character, said that after making the film, it was incredible, something that had never happened to him before, not in any other films. He began to receive letters of both love and hate. Some adored him because he had provided a wonderful example of life. Others hated him because, in truth, he had exposed their mediocrity. He had never experienced anything like that before. He began to receive messages of both love and hate. He created a reference point, a man of impeccable character. There stood an impeccable man. This unsettles some, while it inspires others. A collective reaction begins to emerge. You stir the psyche of people. They feel shaken one way or another. When there are good role models, that is how it works. And this is necessary. A fully realized citizen at some level within a civilization, such individuals should be recognized and encouraged. That is, not only great heroes, but also people who manage to rise one step above the average, who do things that are worthy of praise. Plato speaks of a need for us to have our heroes. Civilization gradually builds its own small heroes, everyday heroes, that person who found a wallet full of money and returned it to its owner. Is he an exceptional being? No, he is an ordinary person, but what he did is something few would do. So he already becomes a story to be cherished, already a step above, already something to be recognized. We reward this, just as we do with our child when they are learning to walk. They take a small step and we celebrate, we call the neighbors. Isn't that so? When they take 2 steps, we throw another celebration, call the neighbors again, bake a cake, do everything. In other words, we encourage every small achievement. How do we guide a child as they learn to walk? Those who guide society do so in the same way. Even if it is a small achievement, look at what this citizen has done. This is highly civilizing. It connects with our archetype. Let us cultivate this. Let us bring it to light. More and more, let this be our pursuit, our aspiration, the thirst, the longing that Plato spoke of. Because we are complete citizens, because we are perfect citizens. So this is a fundamental element. With each step, these citizens are encouraged as they rise. I spoke to you about positive psychology. To speak of goals as something already present to some degree. When we set a reference point, it is not, I will have, that does not work. I have, I am, we are. We are in this very moment, in such a way that what will happen, and I bring this forward here, is that we will generate a sense of displacement, discomfort in the transgressor. The transgressor feels out of place in society, feels like a pariah, feels ostracized. This is a very significant psychological discomfort. In our times, however, a transgressor often feels very comfortable because sometimes he is the rule. The rule that emerges is that the cleverest one, the one who gets ahead at any cost, prevails. So we convey to him the discomfort of being a transgressor and of being on the margins. He becomes a transgressor and stands outside the rules of society. This is very unpleasant, and he will have to go through it. It is difficult to endure. There is a continuous culture that sustains a certain behavior. Transgressors increasingly feel marginalized, and it becomes more difficult. By interacting dancing, singing, reading, I receive reinforcement and pride for these civilizing attributes. In other words, the foundation of everything that comes within my reach. And with the greatest freedom, we will not condition artists to talk about this. But artists are human beings who seek this. Therefore, it is fair that their creations have this goal. I create a work, and I am a person who seeks self-improvement, who seeks fulfillment. Of course, much of who I am will be present in what I do, without anyone forcing me to do so. This generates a whole cultural environment in which the person is immersed and is increasingly encouraged in this direction. The idea is a humanistic embrace for every new member of humanity, offering them content and pathways for their development as individuals and citizens. A humanistic embrace, in such a way that they find themselves fulfilled, grounded, and surrounded on all sides by a civilizational ideal. A complete citizen, a complete human being, evermore in this direction. So, as a parting thought, I brought a question for us to reflect on, inspired by a line from a song by Javan where he says, "Do you know what it is to not have, and yet have to have in order to give?" In other words, we are a generation that did not receive this. What do we do? Shall we wait for the next generation to have it? How will the next generation have it if we do not pass it on to them? Therefore, even without having received, we must have. We must ensure that we possess what we did not receive. We can build and attain it. Otherwise, we will never break this vicious cycle. It is not the next generation who will build this. It is us. It is the sacred office, which is the origin of the word sacrifice. The sacred office is the sacred duty of becoming better, so as to offer a different reference point to other societies. To offer a greater reference for everything you are part of, your family, the groups you participate in, always a higher standard. The one who initiates is the one who is aware. If we are conscious at a certain moment of creating this model, we begin to establish it in the microcosm where we live. And as it is observed and begins to generate influence, it starts to replicate itself. It is always this way. Do not believe in that popular, somewhat cynical saying that a single swallow does not make a summer. On the contrary, one day, a swallow awakened and set off on its migratory flight, and the others followed. Or do you think that great historical changes happened because one day an entire crowd suddenly awakened, eager to change? It was not a handful of citizens who set the direction, and then everyone else followed. It has always been this way, always been this way. Therefore, we cannot wait for the next generation to act. Because they will also say, "I did not receive, therefore I cannot give." Whoever touches their conscience with a truth becomes committed to it. Every time our conscience encounters a truth, we are committed to it. Therefore, this civilizational foundation is based on a model that, at its core, is relatively simple. Although it is complex to implement, the general idea is relatively simple. If you read the 1,200 pages of the book Paideia by Werner Jaeger, you will see that he constantly refers to various authors and influences, but in this sense, this is basically what he is saying, that the Greek man had a reference point in Arete, and this was greater than everything, and it permeated all manifestations of society. And it was a world designed to make man a better citizen and a better human being. Better. Basically, that is what is being said, and proposed as a reference point to be reflected upon and perhaps to consider the ways through which we might dream of updating Paideia, of living Paideia, beginning with ourselves and then observing the impact this brings to society. And that's it. I open the floor for questions. If anyone has anything they would like to ask. Yes, Paideia was the model that was used, the civilizational model that was adopted. Of course, Greece later fell into decline and lost all of this, but it was a model, it was a brilliant historical moment in the history of Greece, when it was guided by the educational model known as Paideia, which made it such a significant people, the cradle of Western civilization. Greece and Rome are the cradle of Western civilization. Thus, it made this civilization a point of reference. Certainly, we are living through a moment of crisis, a peak moment that will bring pain, provoke crises, and will require us to reassess. Now, we do not know how much further we will descend within this model, how much more suffering we must endure before we experience this upward turn. But it is a historical necessity, and as I mentioned, we can address it in groups. New Acropolis does this. In Brazil, in more than 90 schools, and worldwide, in over 60 countries, this is the work we do. A work of formation, with virtues as our goal. If each person were to take on this responsibility, to get involved, to integrate themselves, and to make this work, because the one who lives according to virtue lives in the present moment. This is what the future of humanity will be. And by anticipating this future, such a person becomes a reference point for others. They are a light at the end of the tunnel. Yes, it is essential that you have absolute clarity about your purpose. I usually recommend that you set as your life purpose certain values. For example, I want to be a just and fraternal person. That's it. You might even change these values along the way, but it is important to have a reference point. You may change or expand them because there are no contraindications to such values. And every day, take a moment for reflection. Through what I did today, did I move closer to my reference point? Did I become a little more just? Because you know that gymnastics today exists within competitions. There are people who are capable of doing anything in order to surpass their competitor. They are capable of ignoble acts. Gymnastics itself is neither good nor bad. It depends on what you're doing it for. What are you doing it for? What is it directed towards? I make music. Well, there is noise nowadays that leads people to the worst things. I am wanting to guide myself and others with my music. To where? What is the objective? What is the direction of all this? You should ask yourself this question every day. The reference point of my life is there, of today. With the step I took, did I move in that direction? Did I stand still? Or did I go the opposite way? Because one day is easy to correct. If you stray too far, it becomes more complicated. Every day, put your day to the test under the lens of your purpose. Did what I do bring me closer to it? Was it done with that intention? Because it is possible to connect everything we do. Everything that is necessary, that is good, can be connected. Well, I did not exactly mean lying. I meant that it was necessary to create another myth and perhaps conceal these things. I would not tell children that criminals came to Brazil. Honestly, I would not create that narrative. Now, this would give us a huge discussion because we tend to take things in a very strict sense. Plato has a dialogue in which he talks about this. Is it the Hippias? The lesser. In this lesser Hippias, he talks about lying. He goes on to say that truth is that which is committed to the good and not necessarily to the facts. For example, when a doctor does not tell a patient that they have a fatal illness, or when an angry person is chasing someone to hurt them, and I do not reveal where that person went, and similar situations. In such moments, truth aligns with the good of that person so that violence does not occur. Truth corresponds to the good and not necessarily to facts. There are certain facts in our lives that, out of a sense of modesty, we naturally conceal. We hide facts related to our intimacy. There are also certain things, and I actually believe this is the case, because more people who are not criminals must have come than those who were. I don't know why we place so much focus on this, but certain facts would be better left hidden, while others should be brought to light. We need to understand that lying is a bit more complex than that. It is bound to the idea of the good, to the highest expression of good that we can conceive. So every people has had dual aspects because everything in the world is dual. Every people has had great men and small men. There have been wonderful men and scoundrels. What we did is a kind of lie. We hid the good men in order to reveal the scoundrels. That is also a lie. It is a form of partiality. Shall we do the opposite? Shall we hide the scoundrels and show the good men? Why not? There is purpose in this. This choice has purpose. The other does not. Well, it is not a simple question to answer. I even recommend to you, there's a lecture on YouTube called Philosophy in Education. how values transform the world. In it, I speak about this in a broader way. But in any case, I return to that phrase from Epictetus that I used in a lecture. The seeds of greatness in man need an image in order to blossom and germinate. The best thing you can do is to be the reference point of what you're talking about, because an image has a very powerful impact, a real connection. Coming into contact with such a person leaves a profound impression. Young people, children, are naturally inclined to admire heroes. It is part of their age. If we do not offer constructive, truly human heroes, they will turn to fantastical or nonsensical things. They need the image of heroes. They are very inclined to connect with people who, for them, serve as references. They are very receptive when someone convinces them that they are a true role model. So the best thing to do is to be. Do not show contradictions and be exactly what you are proposing. And even if they have many other options, your example will remain among the choices in their life. At some point, they may choose it again. But I met someone who was not like that. Later on, when faced with a challenge or difficulty, they will remember, I met someone whose choice in life was different. Therefore, it is possible this option exists. You will leave a lasting mark on their life with this. They were all shaped by the same foundations. All of them were readers of Homer and Hesiod, or at least listened to the rhapsodes reciting Homer and Hesiod. Later, all were influenced by Plato. In other words, they all came from a single cultural source. Everyone was being nourished in this way, as were their children. They were always being educated throughout their lives as well. They received references that they would pass on to their children. These were references shared by the whole of society. Therefore, it was not something each person invented for themselves. Everyone was being shaped, both the pedagogue and the father, according to a single foundation, which is the ideal of the Greek man. They all sought the same thing. They were educated for this purpose and were continually reinforced in this role. Thus, this tends to generate coherence, with everyone looking in the same direction. In general, civilizations that take virtues as their reference point possess something of transcendence. Of course, I am not saying that it is impossible to have moral virtues as a reference without this. I do not know. It would have to be tested historically. But the fact is that, in general, they did have it. There was something beyond. It was something. The gods of Olympus, it was about being virtuous enough to honor that, to reach somewhere higher. They had their own quests, indeed. Transcendent. It is as if you consider that all values, all virtues, are attributes of God. Therefore, by possessing virtues, you become similar to God. If you become similar, you draw closer to Him. Necessarily, we draw closer to a human being through their virtues. When we resemble them, we become closer. Therefore, by acquiring virtues, you are acquiring divine attributes. So necessarily, you draw closer to Him. Each person had their own images, their own symbols, which they would display. But it is very common for the two to be associated, indeed. The truth is that vanity will always be circling around us, no matter what we do. Even if I do nothing, vanity will be there. If I do something, it is there as well. Therefore, whatever you do, you will have to learn to deal with this thing called vanity. In Greece, there was a component which was the idea that every Greek man was like this. Therefore, when you do this, you're doing nothing more than your duty as a Greek man. So, this even serves as a tool to soften this aspect. But do not think otherwise, because there are certain things that will always be at your heels. You will always have to keep an eye on them. Vanity, laziness, inertia, tendencies, criticism. There are certain things you will have to control throughout your life. Always, because if your awareness drops, they will catch you. Whether you're doing many things or doing nothing at all. This is the human drama. As for the matter of Buddhism, of transcendence of Buddhism itself, it is as if, in these great Eastern initiatic systems, a disciple, just to step at the threshold, already had to be a virtuous person. These systems distanced themselves greatly from society. They closed themselves off when society stopped producing virtuous individuals to knock at their doors. Society no longer produced candidates fit for these systems, so they withdrew greatly. Each one retreated into solitary religions. Because this is lacking, society no longer produces such individuals. The purpose of society would be precisely this: to cultivate morally prepared people who could knock on the doors of schools of such stature. But it no longer does so. Therefore, it is better to withdraw from civilization. It is no longer a civilizing force. So it is better to withdraw. There was a rupture. There should have been continuity. Society leads up to a certain point, then bam, a virtuous person. From here, if you want to enter transcendence, there are top schools. But they require, at the very least, that you be virtuous. At the very least, just a step onto the carpet. Greece was quite patriarchal, without a doubt. You will see philosophers like Plato in the Republic. When he speaks about the education of the guardians, he included both men and women. He was even criticized for this, because he spoke of both men and women. If we also look at the Iliad and the Odyssey themselves, there are great women within them as well. Several remarkable women. However, Greek civilization had its limitations in this regard. In this respect, it was in essence more patriarchal. But those who created these great traditions, Plato, for example, spoke of women going to war. The Republic is an exemplary book in this regard. In this respect,